Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my definitive video review of the new Canon EOS R7. This is, along with the R10, is Canon's first foray into the APS-C space, utilizing their new RF lens mount. And so in this case, lenses like the 18 to 150 millimeter that I have reviewed as a part of this in kit, they will carry the designation RFS, indicating that they are APS-C lenses that are using the RF mount. Now, in many ways, the R7 is a kind of a mirrorless successor to the very popular 7D series that was Canon's APS-C sports-oriented model in the previous generation. Since that point, however, things have radically improved when it comes to the raw specifications. And so rather than a limit of 10 frames per second, we have as much as 30 frames per second. More on that in just a moment. Rather than having a 20 megapixel sensor, we now have a 32.5 megapixel sensor. Rather than having 65 AF points that cover this portion of the frame, we now have 650 AF zones, 651 to be specific, that cover essentially 100% of the image frame. And as a byproduct of that, you have a camera that is really radically more advanced in its overall performance than what we saw with the 7D Mark II. And despite having a decade of inflation between the release of the 7D Mark II to the EOS R7, we have a $300 price reduction. And so instead of $1,800 US, we have $1,500 US dollars. And so obviously that makes for, on paper at least, a very compelling package. Now, I want to thank Camera Canada for the loaner of the R7 and the 18 to 150 millimeter. They are my go-to retailer here in Canada, and they have been very kind to keep me stocked with Canon loaners. For a while, I didn't have access to them, and so I really appreciate them for helping out with that. So if the EOS R7 is any indication, looking compared to the 7D Mark II, the mirrorless era is a great one. But as we're going to see as we progress through this review, is an amazing R camera, much like what I consider to be amazing cameras in the EOS R5, R6, R3. Are these cameras to be undone by Canon's approach to the RF mount? We'll do our best to answer that question as this review progresses, but first, a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is brought to you by Phantom Wallet, the minimalist modern wallet that is now even better with the new Phantom X that is crafted from aluminum right here in Canada. It is 22% smaller and 35% lighter, while still making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. You could even customize your wallet due to its modular design, with accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even Chipolo and AirTag tracking integration. Visit store.phantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber, and use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out.
So let's talk about the build and features of this camera. In many ways, it is very similar to the footprint of the EOS RP, the smallest Canon full-frame model, with essentially identical specs between the width and the height of the camera, but with a deeper and thus more comfortable grip that is there. The overall size is 132 millimeters wide, 90.4 millimeters tall, and nearly 92 millimeters in depth. And I will note that, like many of Canon's recent cameras, it feels really great in the hands, and I would say noticeably better than cameras like either the X-T4 or the Sony a6600, which are in many ways the primary competitors to this camera. It has a similar degree of weather sealing to the Canon EOS 90D, and so that's to say not at the height of what we saw in, for example, the EOS R5 or the EOS R3, but a compelling degree of weather sealing that in many situations is going to be ample and sufficient. Most of the controls here are pretty familiar. The camera setup is pretty familiar, but there are a few new features that are a part of the design. One of those is that we now have a new control wheel and joystick on the back. While we do have the D-pad that is similar to the EOS RP, we do have a control ring and we have a joystick that is in a new position and with a new design, with the wheel coming around the joystick. And so that replaces a top-mounted wheel, and in that place where the top-mounted wheel was in some previous Canon models, we now have the on-off switch there, and it is now a three-position switch, on-off, and then also video mode. And the best part about that is that when you switch over into the video mode, you are able to have a completely different setup as far as programmable buttons and shortcuts, menu options that are specifically designed around video as opposed to stills. And so it's a great way of kind of that hybrid approach of being able to customize your camera for two different primary functions. And so that is well appreciated. On the front of the camera, we now have where the depth of field preview button, which, you know, that's what it's traditionally been for Canon cameras. It can be programmed to whatever function you want. But now there is an AF/MF lever right there that allows you to switch between that, a feature that is somewhat similar to what I've seen on Fuji cameras and certainly very welcome here. I'll also note, like a lot of recent Canon cameras, that you do have the shutter blades that will come down and protect the sensor when the camera is powered off. And so, for example, when changing lenses, helps to keep dust out of it. That's something that I always really appreciate because it does make a difference. Also worth noting, as always, is that Canon's articulating LCD screen remain the best in the business. They have the highest responsiveness of anything that I'm using at this point, and I will note that Canon's menu design works well with touch in a way that I still haven't seen on either Fuji or Sony. The viewfinder is 2.36 million dot, and while that's not as high a resolution as, say, the XT4, for example, it is as good or better resolution than what we see in some other competing models. So it gets the job done, and it's not noticeably inferior to the higher resolution that you'll find in the original EOS R, for example. Though obviously if you're talking about something like the EOS R5, which even a much higher resolution, you will certainly notice a difference between the two when using it side by side. But I do like the position and the feel of it against the eye better than some of the competing models. And so it kind of comes out of that shuffle in a fairly good position because of the overall usefulness of it. Over on the right side, we do have dual UHS 2 rated SD card slots, so a familiar card format. Power comes from the familiar LP E6NH battery that we've seen in other recent Canon models. The EOS R7 does have Canon's in-body image stabilization, which is very welcome. As always, Canon has done a great job with IBIS, and it is rated, as you can see from this chart, as up to 7 stops, even with some non-image stabilized lenses, and up to 8 stops with some of the image stabilized lenses like the 24-105 f4 LIS. I will note that it does seem very effective in use. I was very impressed with its ability, for example, with the 18-150 millimeter for handheld video shots. It felt very stable as a platform for that. But I will note that it's not a replacement for a gimbal when it comes to movement, where there is still that real, exaggerated pitch of moving when you're actually stepping with it. Another feature that I do appreciate here is there is a new auto level feature, and if you've ever struggled in getting those horizons straight, if you enable that, it actually uses the ability that sensor can move, much like in-body image stabilization, to actually do a minor tilt to adjust for the proper perspective of the horizon, and so that is a genuinely useful new feature here. Typical mode dial on the front. There is no top-mounted LCD screen. They've reserved that for their more expensive higher-end models. But frankly, I think that having an actual mode dial is just as intuitive, and it is actually faster than having the dual selection process on, for example, the EOS R5 that I'm so familiar with. All in all, this is a familiar camera that has familiar ports, familiar performance, great ergonomics, feels very good in the hand. This is something that Canon, I think, does really well, up to including the hot shoe, which is now a multi-interface port, which allows you to do things like digital audio through that port as well, with appropriate mics. And so all of these things are very welcome. This is a camera that, if you've used Canon's mirrorless cameras, full frame mirrorless cameras, it feels pretty much instantly familiar in hand and feels great in hand. Great ergonomics, and so I have nothing but praise for it when it comes to that front. Now, as noted, autofocus comes really via an inheritance from the top-end EOS R3 flagship model, in that we have a similar focus system, including 651 autofocus zones that covers essentially 100% of the sensor. It has a very fast burst rate, either in mechanical shutter, 15 frames per second, which looks like this. And by the way, that actually exceeds the EOS R3 by 3 frames per second. This is the fastest mechanical shutter we've got in a Canon mirrorless camera right now. And so that obviously obviously is a plus, but you can go even faster with 30 frames per second using the electronic shutter. Now, I will note that the electronic shutter here is not as well implemented as what it is in the EOS R3, which is more designed around that, and that there are more limitations when it comes to certain features, you know, like auto or anti-flicker technology, things like that, flash sync. I use the Sony Alpha 1 all the time, and really these cameras that are designed around an electronic sensor, they've solved a lot of the problems, rolling shutter issue, things like that, that are associated with electronic shutter. You're not going to find that degree of implementation here. So there are a few limitations for electronic shutter, but obviously getting 30 frames per second allows this to be truly a sports model. And even at the 15 frames per second, you have got 50% more frames per second compared to the 7D Mark II. It has very good tracking capabilities, and obviously one thing that I think actually Canon does particularly well relative to other brands is that in the process of tracking, you have better visual indicators of what is being tracked, what's going on, movement of things that are going. In the actual electronic viewfinder, there's a lot of very useful information that makes you feel very connected to the tracking process. And another thing that I did note that I think that kind of this model and other Canon cameras stand out for is that they have really good tracking even when you get towards the very edge of the frame. And so, for example, in my fast charging dogs, even when they're starting to get out of the frame to the side, I notice that tracking is still quite sticky in that. And so, they do really well with that. I found that my misses here, and by the way, I used what I had on hand, and so in some cases I used the 18-150, which is the kit lens here. I also used a little bit better 24-105 f4 LIS, which I own, for tracking. Now, obviously, something like a 70-200, f2.8, or the 100-500 L, those would have been better options, but I didn't have either one of those on hand. So what I found is that my tracking wasn't quite as effective as what I saw with the EOS R3, but I think that does come down to lens options here. But for the most part, the misses came in a couple of scenarios. It came either when the subject got really close to the camera, which is quite typical, and tracking becomes a little bit more difficult. But I also noted a few cases where focus kind of got stuck, and if I let off the shutter and then allowed it to pick up again, held it down halfway and then started a new burst, I was able to get effective tracking once again. And so I think, again, using a better lens is going to give you better performance. But of course, one thing that Canon is going to have to do is to provide some good, particularly RFS type lenses that are going to give you effective tracking, because otherwise you're stuck with the very expensive full frame options, and they are very, very expensive. I also found that IAF worked very well in a wide variety of situations with good focus either on human or animal subjects. No issues that I had with that. I used the 18-150 to track a softball game, and I found that, acquiring and then tracking action was no problem in that kind of lower pressure environment, zero issues there. And so, very effective with that. Now, compared to the R3, while we have a similar focus system, what we don't have is the same kind of processing power and buffer depth. And so I really feel that the 30 frames per second in particular is limited by buffer depth. So if you're shooting uncompressed RAWs, you only have a buffer depth of 42 images. So if you're doing the math, that is, it's less than 1.4 seconds worth of burst before the buffer fills, and it will take, about 10 seconds or so for it to clear. So you either have to really, really be effective at timing when you're going to do that burst if you want 30 frames per second, or you might want to do a couple of other options. One of those options is to choose Canon's excellent C-RAW, which is a lossless compressed RAW option, which does allow you to increase that buffer, but less so when shooting at 30 frames per second. I find that really the best option, unless you absolutely need 30 frames per second, use the mechanical shutter and the 15 frames per second, and you're going to get more buffer depth out of that. For example, if you use C-RAW and the mechanical shutter, you can get up to 181 shots. And so that's obviously going to be, 187 shots, which obviously gives you a much bigger window for shooting a prolonged burst. And on top of that, if you're even using compressed RAW, if you shoot at 30 frames per second, you're only getting 51 frames. And so there's a radical difference between using the mechanical and the electronic shutter. So for me, I think if I own this camera, I would only use that 30 frames per second when absolutely necessary to allow me to get a quick burst and then get off. And so I think that you'll find you're going to get better results when using the 15 frames per second in most scenarios. I also found that autofocus works very well for video purposes, and when doing focus pulls with the 18-150, I found a good damping, very silent operation, very smooth, and also very confident in locking focus. So that is certainly an area where this model best like the X-T4, for example, when it comes to video focus capabilities. Speaking of video, we can get up to 4K 60 frames per second, which is competitive with the X-T4, betters the A6600, and the footage looks really, really great. We've got 7K oversampling, and so the footage is very crisp, very nicely detailed, and I think it really stands out. You can get up to 120 frames per second in shooting full HD, and there is a wide variety of various formats and bit rates available, and in a very nice and welcome change, your recording is only limited by your storage medium, how much space you have to record, and or heat maybe at very high bit rates. And so there is some indication that maybe at about an hour at the highest bit rates, you might have shut down due to heat, but I haven't seen any heat related issues in my particular test to this point. And so certainly that is something that Canon has gotten progressively better at. And there is actually a heat management sub-menu that allows you some options on how you want to handle heat as it begins to build in the camera. You've also got higher end features like C-Log 3 and HDR PQ, which gives you a little bit more of cine options that have been brought into this camera. And I remember it doesn't seem all that long ago where I was actually paying for a C-Log 3 upgrade for my 5D Mark IV, a much more expensive camera than this. Also having that great in-body image stabilization and great autofocus helps in all of the various video performance. So let's talk about the image quality. This is the highest resolution APS-C sensor that I've ever tested. To my knowledge, it's the highest one on the market right now at 32.5 megapixels. And while that resolution is shared with two other Canon models, Canon does say that this is a freshly developed sensor for the EOS R7. So we're going to dive in and take a look at how it holds up in terms of its resolution, its dynamic range, its ISO performance. And so let's dive in and let's take a look at that.
So first of all, a few general observations about this particular sensor at 32.5 megapixels. It is the highest resolution APS-C sensor that I have ever tested. And it shows some of the typical Canon strengths. For example, here you can see some beautiful color rendition. Likewise in this image. And of course, that extra resolution means that you have the ability to capture just a lot of detail. And so we can see in this image, even though it's early morning, layers of mist here, but there's just a lot of detail throughout the image, and even using the 18 to 150 millimeter lens. Likewise here, good detail, as you can see here. Also, beautiful color once again. And if we take a look here with that higher resolution, you have the ability, for example, I could change this crop and crop quite deeply. And as we can see, even here on a 4K monitor, there's still enough resolution for, me to go in a bit. And so this is something that would still, print fine, for example, and is a, fairly deep crop from what we started with here, and, produces a credible image. So obviously that's going to be very useful in a wildlife or sports-oriented camera where you have that ability to crop and get potentially even more reach in camera. I also found that, while capturing action, that I was able to get, obviously, we've already talked about autofocus, but the ability to get well-focused results in action allows you to get nice detail even with a very fast-moving subject like this charging golden retriever. So that's obviously going to be a, useful quality in a camera like this. So we're going to dive into dynamic range and break things down. So this is my base exposure for what I'm working for. We'll take just a quick tour here. You can see everything is inky black. There's no, at ISO 100, there is no visible noise anywhere. Very, very clean, obviously, as you would expect at a, from a modern camera. So in our first series, we're going to take a look at underexposure and the camera's ability to recover shadows. And so here on the left side, we have underexposed by one stop, and then I've added that stop in back in post, which represents your ability to recover that one stop of lost shadow information. So just a quick reference, you can see, for example, here we've got already starting to get a bit of crushing on the grip of the Spotmatic. You can see its ability to recover there. That's only one stop, so no problem. So we'll skip ahead to 3 stops, and so you can see here on the left side that already things, have gotten really crushed here, but we can see as we look at the areas that are, the shadows are being deeply recovered, that we're getting back all of that information that was lost. And if we look down here, you can see that there's very little noise. If we look into the blacks here, we can see that there's no color banding, and just taking a quick look at our swatches up here, we can see that there's very little grain that's been added. It's just a very good recovery at 3 stops. Likewise, at 4 stops, we see mostly similar here. There is the just tiniest bit of pattern noise there in this deeper recovery. We can see, for example, in this area, this was completely crushed, no information there. We're still seeing that information, and if we look towards the shadow, there's a fine grain that's starting to settle in, but the shadows are still nice and black. Contrast is still good, and at a global level, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference from the original base exposure, even though that's how crushed we were. Now, the practical limit comes between the 4-stop recovery and the 5-stop recovery, which I've got on the right. You can see that now we have got some color shift that has entered in. And in fact, if we zoom in here, we can see that there is some blotchiness in the shadow information. You can really see some of that color blotching that is everywhere in the recovered areas. And you can see that the noise pattern has probably risen to an unacceptable level. And so your limit is just a little over 4 stops for shadow recovery. Now, if we go the opposite direction, we're going to have a series of images where I've intentionally overexposed by 1, 2, 3, and 4 stops, and we're going to see its ability to recover all of the various colors, swatches, highlights. And so, for example, here already at 1 stop of overexposure, you can see that some of the texture information was lost off of the face there, but we can see that in the recovery by reducing exposure by 1 stop, that we have no problem. Likewise with any of our colors. Now, if we go to 2 stops of overexposure, you can see that it's very obviously overexposed, blown out areas all over the place. So, for example, in the timer face, you can see that texture information was lost, color was lost, but it is all recoverable. And likewise in the Spotmatic, you can see that all that texture information has come back. Likewise up here in colors, they've retained their proper saturation after bringing that exposure back down. So overall, at 2 stops, still a very clean performance. Now, at 3 stops, while the end result isn't perfect, it's actually better than what I expected. And I think this is actually a relative strength, even more so than shadow exposure, just relative to what I typically see. We can see that while I don't think it's 100% recovered on the timer face, it is, for the most part, recovered. And likewise here, while there is still a little bit of texture information that has been lost there on the camera face, by and large, it looks quite good. And looking up here at our color swatches, we can see that over here, a lot of colors that were completely lost have been recovered fairly well and fairly cleanly, even at 3 stops. And so one other place, we'll look down here on this book face. Again, not 100% texture recovery, but overall, look at this area right here. It's very nicely recovered. And so I think that, overall, I think that's still an acceptable recovery at 3 stops. Now, we find our practical limit between the 3 and 4 stops of overexposure. And so here you can see that even after an attempt at recovery, you can see that some of the color swatches, the information has been lost. We can see looking at the timer face, like here it was on the edge, but here there's no question. There's a lot of texture information that's lost. Likewise on the face of the camera, it just doesn't look natural any longer. Down here on the book, we've lost the ability to retain some of that contrast. There's just texture information that is lost. And so that is our practical limit, but still you can see that we're getting a fairly decent performance, and according to Photons to Photos, we've got right under 10 and a half stops of dynamic range, which test out fairly well. The best in the class is the Sony sensor, and it's less than a half stop better than that. And that has practical real-world value. You can see, for example, in this shot, there's both some crushed shadows, a completely blown-out sky. Just moving the Lightroom sliders, however, I was able to bring, like, for example, in this girl's face, you can see very nice recovery of just kind of natural color and brightness of her face. Likewise here, texture information in the sweater that has been retained. And then if we look up at the sky, we've gotten back a fairly natural-looking sky out of what was completely blown out to begin with. So overall, definitely a useful amount of dynamic range in this sensor. Now going back to our setup here for one other series, and that's going to be taking a look at ISO performance. And so in this case, our base ISO, everything as we've already seen, looks nice and clean. Blacks are completely inky, no noise information. And we'll just take a look at how that changes as we increase the ISO. So I'm going to skip over the first in between 3 stops at 200, 400, and 800, and we'll go right to 1600. Modern cameras, 1600 is no big deal at all. And as we're going to see, there is really, even at a pixel level, you're hardly seeing any additional noise that's been added in. It's there, but it's so fine that you really can't hardly see it. The shadows look just as inky. Everything looks nice and clean here. The overall contrast looks very, very similar. No problem there. Now, even as we go up to 3200, as we're going to see, there is a little bit of an increase of just a very, very fine noise, as you can see. But again, looking down here, contrast looks very similar. You can see if you look at the mirror face that there is a little bit of noise that's being introduced there. And if we look down at here where it tends to show up, which is why I shoot here, you can see that there is a little bit of noise there. But you can also see that the shadows are nice and inky, and at a global level, it's basically indistinguishable. Now, as we go from here, you're going to see a minimal sense of diminished returns as you go. So starting with looking between 3200 and the next stop, which is 6400, a very fine additional amount of noise that is there. Contrast and detail looks very similar. You can see looking at the face of the mirror, there's a tiny bit more noise, likewise down here, but it's not hugely noticeable, and everything still looks consistently black up here, though just a tiny shade brighter due to starting to see some inconsistent pixels. Now in the stop from 6400 to 12,800, we can see that the shadows are starting to lift a little bit. You can see just a little bit of maybe some banding that is taking place there. Looking at the grip here, again, the texture is still pretty consistent, but as you look inside here, the noise level is just getting more obvious as we go. And if we look down here on the right, you can see it's just looking rougher in general. However, if we take a step back and look at this at a global level, the image still looks very useful, and while at a global level you can see a tiny, a little bit of that noise, I think that in many situations, depending on the subject, it would still be acceptable. This is where I would consider the typical upper limit of what I would use, and we'll see why as we go up in the natural range. Even on a global level, you can see that there is a pretty significant difference between 12,800 and 25,600. Looking here, you can see that there's some obvious noise that you really don't see there. If we jump in and take a look at color swatches, you can see the noise pattern is rougher. And then if we look down towards here, just in general, you can see that the shadows are really starting to lift due to that, just the way that the noise is rendering there. And so you're starting to lose contrast, as you can see, in a pretty noticeable way. Now, in theory, there is another third stop available up to ISO 3200 in the normal range, not the expanded range, but you can see that even in that bit from 25,600 to 32,000, that things just really get just much worse. You can see much more banding in the shadows. If we pan over here, you can see that there's some really obvious discoloration, and kind of a green tint that is starting to enter in there into that information. And it's not what I would consider usable image quality. So just giving you a quick comparison again, the difference between 12,800 and 32,000 is pretty radical there. And so, as I said, if you'll stick with 12,800 as kind of your practical upper limit, and it comes to ISO performance, I think you'll be happier with your end results. Overall, however, this is the best APS-C sensor that I have seen to this point from Canon.
So as you can see, this really across the board is a very feature-rich, high-performing camera. And as one of Canon's very first forays into APS-C on this platform, I think that they have done a great job in nailing the particulars of a camera like this. As noted, it feels great in the hands, it's easy to use, it has great performance when it comes to, its autofocus, it has a high-resolution sensor, it has great in-body image stabilization, it has a lot going for it. But it is another example of a great camera, much like the EOS R5, that is limited by both the lens selection and by the pricing of those lenses. Canon RF lenses are really, really expensive, and that becomes even more of a factor when you're buying a less expensive camera body. At $1,500, that's nothing to sneeze at in terms of price, but when you're talking about any of the telephoto options that you might consider for that being considerably more expensive than the actual camera itself, that becomes a limiting principle. And it seems like Canon, for at least the immediate future, is going to be very close to the idea of third-party development, which means that we're not going to get less expensive but high-quality options from companies like, Sigma or Tamron, for example, which means you're going to be stuck essentially using Canon RF lenses or adapting Canon EF mount lenses, which comes with its own, set of drawbacks. At the moment, there are only 2 RFS mounted lenses, and basically they are ported over EFM mounted lenses that have been repackaged in this RFS platform. And I will note that it doesn't give me a whole lot of hope is that the EFM platform, EFM mount that started with the EOS M mirrorless camera, Canon's first mirrorless, that, in 10 years, there's less than 10 lenses that have been developed for the platform. So I certainly hope that Canon is a little more diligent in fleshing out the RFS lens lineup. And if they don't, it's going to be very unfortunate because this is a camera that has great potential, but I do believe that probably the weakness is going to be the lenses that you mount to the camera and whether or not you can afford the lenses that are available at the moment. So the byproduct is that I have a very high score for the camera itself. It's a very compelling camera. The question is whether or not Canon can then make the whole RFS system equally compelling. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review. You can also find linkage there to some buying links if you'd like to purchase one for yourself, links to follow myself or Craig on social media, to become a patron, to purchase channel merchandise, and of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching, have a great day, and let the light in.